And then the last step is act. And I put the last step as act because that's what your brain moves towards first. Your brain will always sacrifice a hard decision tomorrow for an easy decision, an easy way out today, which is why we see so many smart companies and so many smart leaders and so many companies that are data driven get this critical moment wrong and fail to appropriately respond to a crisis, and it only makes the crisis worse. So you're kind of like spiraling out of control. If you mismanage that critical moment, you start to a death spiral for your organization, and you really limit options. You make the information environment worse. You're constraining your next moves, and in some ways, you're pinning your own people against you.
Your business's success depends on relationships with customers, relationships with employees, and relationships with stakeholders. What do they all have in common? They're all human. Because no matter if your business is B2B or B2C, it's really H to H, human to human. Welcome to the Human Connection Podcast. I'm your host, Carl Ponto. Each week I bring you stories, insights, and practical advice from experts that you can apply to your growing company and daily life. This week I'm excited to connect with Joe Buccino. He is a retired U.S. Army colonel, former Pentagon spokesman, and strategic communications leader who has spent his career advising senior leaders during moments when the stakes were highest and the margin for error was small. During nearly 3 decades of military service, he served in several of the Department of Defense's most demanding communication roles. He was the communications director at the U.S. Central Command, where he helped guide public messaging during one of the most volatile periods in the Middle East in decades. Earlier, he served as spokesman for the Secretary of Defense and led communications for senior military commands responsible for global operations. Throughout his career, he worked at the center of major geopolitical events, helping leaders explain complex military operations, manage crises, and communicate clearly under intense public scrutiny. His work has involved coordinating messaging across the Pentagon, the White House, Congress, allied governments, and international media. Today, he advises organizations on strategic communication, crisis leadership, and navigating high-stakes moments when credibility and clarity matter most. He is also a frequent media commentator on national security and leadership, appearing on major broadcast networks and writing on defense and public affairs. He is the author of When Every Word Counts: How to Earn Trust, Command Attention, and Communicate Clearly in Any Situation, a practical guide to communicating effectively during high-pressure leadership moments. Congrats on When Every Word Counts. Thank you for your service, and welcome to the Human Connection Podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. And I'm in a new role now. I'm the House Republican Comms Director. That happened after we set this up. But yeah, so I'm in a new role. We're in session this week, and just a lot happening in my life and with this new job and the book.
Yeah, I imagine. Yeah, I'm great to have you on the show because I think it's the with how much things are changing, and there's obviously a lot of uncertainty and instability. Being able to clearly communicate and actually reach people during these sorts of periods is more important than ever. So tell me more about how you work to meet people where they are when you're communicating and how to really help find that beating heart during a crisis situation.
Yeah, I think in crisis, a lot of leaders go immediately towards action and towards movement and solution. And they feel like speed is an effort of leadership or a function of effective leadership. And that's really not the case. Really the first thing that you've got to do in a critical moment, I first of all, to maybe take a step back, ahead of every crisis that I've worked, whether it was, I worked the Alaska Airlines where the door came off the plane. I worked some major geopolitical crises involving, Russia, Ukraine, American withdrawal from Afghanistan, Israel-Gaza, and now in politics. There's always a critical moment ahead of a crisis. So we tend to think about, people tend to think about crisis as two trains, crashing in the middle of the night, unexpected. Generally, if you look at the critical moment, you can see these trains are coming together in slow motion. And if your antenna's up and you're scanning the environment, you can identify a critical moment. And that's in the first part of the book. In a critical moment, the first thing that you really have to do for success is to meet your audience where they are emotionally. If it's a company and you're a leader in a company, whether it's within your own family, whether it's you lead a small team, you've got to identify their emotion, identify where they are in terms of fear, anger, confusion, joy, whatever it is, and you've got to sit and live in that emotion with them. Just acknowledge that emotion before you move on to a plan. That doesn't mean letting emotion run the decision cycle. It doesn't even mean agreeing with that emotion or agreeing with the people, but you've got to see them, and meeting them where they are is a matter of informing them, look, I see you, I validate this emotion, we're in this together, we're in this moment together and in this emotion together, and now we're going to lead through it.
Yeah, I think that understanding how emotions really drive the show and just drive decision making, and especially when people emotions are high, if you aren't taking the time to acknowledge them and don't address them and show people that you understand it, then you're always going to be talking past them or communicating something that is going to indicate that you don't actually understand or acknowledge their situation. And that just makes actually communicating or influencing them next to impossible.
Yeah, I think when we did the Alaska Airlines door incident at Boeing, Boeing made the plane, and the door was manufactured by a plane maker in Wichita, Kansas. The the organization had been under so much pressure and so much negative press for so long. They had to push out their former CEO. They had the 737 MAX crashes. They had furloughs. They had firings. They had quality escapes. And the people there, the mechanics and the engineers and the technicians, they were carrying the weight of that. They felt embarrassed within their own communities. All those communities, Wichita, Kansas, or Renton, Washington, are built around Boeing. So you either work for Boeing or somebody who works there. And they were, deeply humiliated by this. And so what I advise the CEO is, within 72 hours, you need to bring everybody in, everybody that can fit in the largest conference room you've got, and then by extension, do it remotely, and keep bringing people in, do multiple sessions so you can talk to as many face-to-face as you can, and acknowledge where they are. Just acknowledge, look, we're in this together. I know this is not why you came into this business. You came into this business to make these incredible machines that serve the world and connect the world. And I know you do that and take care in your quality. And this does not represent who you are. It's a moment that we're in, and we will lead through this together. It took them like a minute to say that, just the way I said it. And whenever I have a principal talking to people, I always try to view it from three sides of the room. I move around the room, and you could just feel them open up. You can tell when somebody's opening up their physical space and they're opening up their mind. And so, that was kind of the first effort. So it's not necessarily a long effort, but you've got to have something that acknowledges where they are and meet them where they are emotionally before you move to action.
Yeah, it seems like in general, the rushing to act instead of taking the time to acknowledge the humans involved and the emotions involved seems to be a common theme in business and in the world, where people are so used to trying to move faster than humanity is capable of, or capable of doing in a sustained manner. And so paradoxically, to the minds that many leaders and executives are in, is the key to success and actually managing effectively through these rough periods is to slow down and connect more, because the rate they're trying to move and the bias towards just getting things out the door as quickly as possible to be first or whatever is doing more harm than good.
Yeah. So I think speed is actually a liability in pressurized situations, because in a pressurized situation, I spent a lot of time with some neuroscientists on this effort, but in a pressurized situation, your mind's limbic system is moving towards action, and it's operating off of emotion versus off of fact and evidence. That's just the way our brains are wired. So
Mhm.
your brain can't distinguish between a reputational threat and a physical threat. And so if you think about, our ancestors 3,000 years ago, that you see something out in the wild, you see a tiger out in the wild, you see a big cat, you see a threat, you see a predator, and your brain dumps this dopamine and moves from thinking rationally into pushing blood into your arms and legs so you can either fight or flee. And that's the same thing. The mind doesn't distinguish between a reputational threat and a physical threat, but they can't be adjudicated the same way. They can't be addressed the same way. So you have to pause, you have to acknowledge, meet them where they are. Then the second step is align with your organization on a way forward. And then the last step is act. And I put the last step as act because that's what your brain moves towards first. Your brain will always sacrifice a hard decision tomorrow for an easy decision, an easy way out today, which is why we see so many smart companies and so many smart leaders and so many companies that are data driven get this critical moment wrong and fail to appropriately respond to a crisis, and it only makes the crisis worse. So you're kind of like spiraling out of control. If you mismanage that critical moment, you start to a death spiral for your organization, and you really limit options. You make the information environment worse. You're constraining your next moves, and in some ways, you're pinning your own people against you.
Yeah, I can see how getting that initial response wrong leads to more pressure, more stress, more crises, and if you're not able to respond to them properly, then yeah, it does spiral out of control quickly. And you had mentioned kind of the way to pause and understand your audience is the first step. And you mentioned the second step is align. Tell me more about the align step before the action, because it seems like even if you do the first one but don't have the alignment, then your action's not going to be the right one. So what is that align step, and how do people align themselves with the audience in the way that you recommend?
Yeah, so the align is a measure of buy-in. So you're getting your organization synchronized with you and tied up with you before your way forward. So you're presenting, here's the way forward as I see it. Here are the steps. Here's the plan. Here's the objectives. And here's the metrics. Here's how we're going to know that we've succeeded in this. And so you've got to, you've really got to get your organization on board before you act. Otherwise, again, you're just moving towards speed without a full organization relative behind you. And so, it's acknowledge, meet them where they are, then align them on the way forward. And that's a presentation to the organization, developing buy-in, developing subordinate leader buy-in, and then acting. Once you've got those first two pieces, you've got momentum behind action, and then you can work your way out of the situation. A lot of times, if you acknowledge and align and then act, you can actually come out of a pressurized situation or a critical moment in a better position than when you went in, which was the case for Boeing with the Alaska Airlines door incident. We engendered so much goodwill with the press because we pushed out so much information on background and on the record throughout the crisis. It was frankly, it was a 5-month crisis while the National Transportation Safety Board looked into this. We engendered so much goodwill that reputationally we actually came out in a better position than when we started.
Yeah, it's impressive to see when an organization or someone has to deal with that sort of crisis and they come out stronger because of it in a better situation, and then they would have been if they hadn't been through the crisis. And it is, I can think of a lot of anecdotes or times I've heard people talk about on this show of times where people, like the leadership, didn't align, didn't communicate the information with their teams and get that buy-in. And I think there's the lack of trust or the confusion that comes really, if they don't communicate properly, is the key factor for causing the actions they're trying to take to fail, because people,
Yeah.
if they don't get the right information and they try and fill in the gaps with assumptions, which are almost always going to be mistaken or wrong in some way, and that can quickly spiral out of control and lead to people actually like sabotaging, either inadvertently or directly, the plan that leadership is trying to put in place, just because they're assuming facts that aren't accurate, but because they weren't communicated, our brain, like I said, our brains are wired to fill in those gaps. We want to have an understanding. We don't like not knowing about things, and it's easier to assume, and then you base all your actions on those assumptions. So from the leadership standpoint, I can see how the alignment step is just as important as the meeting people where they are, because if you're not able to communicate, here's what we're going to do, and here's how you fit into it, and here's how this is going to be better for all of us, including your team members, that makes it a lot easier to, and actually just makes it possible to execute on those plans and arrive in a stronger position after the crisis, like what you did with Boeing, versus spiraling into more and more crises because your team members are not doing the steps that it takes to actually implement the plan.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a number of stories. There's actually 21 stories in the book When Every Word Counts, which you can order now on Amazon. There's a number of stories that really give life to the idea that we're talking about here. Stories where I got it right, stories where I got it wrong. I think the ones where I got it wrong are actually more interesting. But, you think about what we talked about, meeting them where they are. So once the emotion is acknowledged, then the second failure mode arrives, and that the second failure mode is the pull towards quick relief. So, under pressure, the brain prioritizes what feels good now over, data-driven plans for later. And so, that's why crisis response so often produces statements that sound reassuring but don't really say anything and put you in a worse position, or gestures that show movement without any direction. And a lot of times, the entire response will collapse under scrutiny. So alignment is the antidote to emotion. To align is to establish a shared understanding of what the situation requires. And you always want to think as a leader, what is this going to look like in 96 hours? What is this going to look like in 6 months? What do we want it to look like in 96 hours? What do we want it to look like in 6 months? To me, that's real leadership. And I've seen it in the White House. I've seen it in the Pentagon. I've seen it in corporate America. I've seen it now in Capitol Hill. And so I think the situations change, but the framing of it does not. And so I think, we work through all that in the book. The third step is the one that leaders reach for instinctively, which is why I put it as the last one. It belongs as a third, which is act. Act without alignment is panic. Act without acknowledgement is incoherence. And when action follows both alignment and acknowledgement, you've got a deliberate move by a group that understands the situation and agrees on what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I like that framing of that the steps, doesn't matter what the context is, whether it's a business or personal or at a governmental level, those 3 steps are still applicable, because in the end you're dealing with human beings, and it doesn't matter the context that the crisis is existing in, but you're still have to start by acknowledging that you're working with humans, and that there's going to be that emotional element to it. And I like what you said about how the action without alignment is panic, and then action without the understanding is incoherence. I think there's a lot of incoherent panic, and you can tell, like I said, if someone is just doing something, putting something out there just to get something out there, and when you read it, like, they didn't really say anything, and it comes across as so disingenuous, and it's almost become a meme in itself, how often you see these corporate messages that are, I guess, going by the numbers and don't really have any real like humanity behind them. And I think it's because they're missing that first step, and they're just jumping right to the third one without really understanding their audience. And it's sad how like people now can just feel it when they're hearing it or reading it. Like it's so obvious, or so trained to see it because it's been done wrong so many times.
Yeah, maybe the last thing I just say is that chapter 3 of the book describes that right now leaders are operating in a trust deficit. There's so much that has happened, and I trace this back to the failures and lies of the Vietnam War, Watergate, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, all the failings of the traditional press during around the invasion of Iraq, the failures of the press during the 2016 election and the election of Trump, everything that the scientific community got wrong during COVID. There's so many, and then you compound on top of that AI, which gives people very fast answers and pushes false information very quickly. You add on top of that the rise of newer media like podcasters who, in a lot of cases, are kind of know-nothings that have an opinion on something that they're not well-versed or literate on. You add on top of that the distrust of experts in a lot of fields, which is, they've rightly earned distrust from the American people. And you combine all those things together and you're operating in a trust deficit. Really, Edelman PR does an annual trust survey, and 72% last year, 72% of workers in America do not trust their leadership to do the right thing by them. And so that's not, to me, a reflection of any leaders in specific. It's a reflection of society and the country where we are. So all that to say that if you don't meet them where they are, you're going to lose them immediately. And that's truer now than it ever has been. And it's going to be truer into the future as AI makes misinformation and disinformation so much faster and so much more prevalent.
With me today, Joe. If you enjoyed this episode of the Human Connection podcast, please leave a comment, and subscribe. If you want to learn more about myself or Joe, check out the links in the show notes. And remember, no matter if your business is B2B or B2C, it's really H to H, human to human. Happy connecting.